In his monumental Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant laid out his architectonic philosophical system. The formal structure of his system consists of the table of judgments, from which he deduced the table of categories. The nature of judgments and categories are mostly irrelevant for our purposes, but what should be noted is that both of them are necessary for experience. It's through judgments that representations are united under transcendental laws, and the categories are the preconditions of any experience or representation at all. These categories apply to the realm of experience and not the noumenal world, of which nothing can be spoken since it lies beyond the subject's transcendental horizon. Kant essentially takes the Aristotelian categories and brings them into his own system of Transcendental Idealism, and this is where the problems begin. The philosophers immediately following Kant noted two major issues with his system. The first is the inaccessibility of the noumena, making belief in its existence nothing more than a dogmatic act of faith. The second issue is the fact that Kant failed to provide any grounding for the categories of understanding. They were given no absolute foundation or first principle. That's to say, as opposed to deducing the categories from a self-evident or absolute ground, he simply assumes and includes them within his system. It's this second critique of Kant that we'll focus on here. To my knowledge, the claim that the Kantian categories are groundless and therefore dogmatic was first made by Karl Reinhold, who was both a follower and critic of Kant. He argued that philosophy must begin with the first principle in order to avoid dogmatism. This insight greatly influenced Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who, as a self-proclaimed Kantian, wanted to provide a foundation for the table of categories. The foundation he proposed was the self-positing I. Now, before proceeding any further, I want to quickly go back to Kant and discuss what he calls Transcendental Apperception, because I'm convinced that this was one of the most influential ideas on Fichte's doctrine of the self-positing I. Transcendental Apperception for Kant is essentially the I think that lies behind every representation. It's the unity of identity that is necessary for any experience whatsoever. Kant distinguishes transcendental apperception from empirical apperception, otherwise referred to as one's inner sense. Leibniz had developed the concept of apperception before Kant, but his understanding was limited to empirical apperception, which is the subjective awareness of one's ever-changing and particular mental states. To use psychoanalytical terms, empirical apperception is closer to the ego, while transcendental apperception is closer to the subject itself. Now, according to Kant, there's a unity of apperception which is necessary for all experience and the categories. In other words, it's the precondition of the preconditions of experience. This unity is the self, the transcendental self, the I. In order for me to have any experience, there must be an original me to unite these experiences into representations, and this original unity is transcendental apperception. Quote, "What often gets lost in philosophical debates about Kant's account of the unity of apperception is that this is ultimately the transcendental self, i.e., the I, which is my identity and which lies behind all my changing experience as something which remains the same." Unquote. The role of this transcendental self that remains the same behind the ever-changing flux of appearances is the unification of these appearances into one knowledge. If there was not this unification, there could be no self. There would only be what David Hume called the flux of perceptions. In fact, Kant claims that the transcendental unity of apperception is the condition of the forms of intuition, that is, space and time themselves. Quote, "Even the purest objective unity, namely, that of the a priori concepts, space and time, is only possible through relation of the intuitions to such a unity of consciousness." Unquote. Thus, not only does Kant save the subject after Hume's reduction of subjectivity to the flux of perceptions, this transcendental subject is the very precondition of his entire system. And this should provide some important context for the next section of this video, which is on Fichte's concept of the self-positing I. The self-positing I is very much akin to the unity of transcendental apperception. However, they differ insofar as the self-positing I is not merely the precondition of the concepts, the categories, and experience as such, but it's their very ground. In the science of knowledge, Fichte systematically deduced all of the Kantian categories from the self-positing I, but that goes beyond the scope of this video. In his magnum opus, Less Than Nothing, Slavoj Žižek credits Fichte with the insight that the subject is not simply self-conscious, but self-positing. By this, Fichte means something very specific, and that's that the I is an act. The subject is, in fact, nothing more than its act of self-positing. To quote Fichte, "The self's own positing of itself is thus its own pure activity. The self posits itself, and by virtue of this mere self-assertion, it exists, and conversely, the self exists and posits its own existence by virtue of merely existing." Unquote. Thus, there's no underlying substance that grounds the self-positing of the I. It's both the posited and that which posits. Furthermore, it's both absolutely self-evident and absolutely groundless. In other words, it's the absolute or the first principle that Kant lacked. But let's back up a bit. As we noted at the beginning of the video, what Kant lacked was a ground or foundation for his system. Fichte set out to ground the Kantian system in an absolute first principle. He begins the science of knowledge with what is seemingly the most self-evident proposition: A is A. A is not the equivalent of A is, because to say A is to ascribe some content to A, namely being. A remains true whether or not A exists, as it's the form rather than the content which is absolutely true. What's truly being said, then, is not that A exists, but that if A exists, then A exists. Therefore, what's even more originary than both subject and predicate in this proposition is the necessary or absolute connection between if and then. To be clear, this is because the if and then relationship constitutes the logical form of the law of identity, which is self-evident. This connection Fichte calls X, and again, X is more originary or what grounds subject and predicate. Fichte will then go on to claim that X is the self which posits, because only the self can make the judgment that if A exists, then A exists. Thus, the self is the grounding of the ground. It's the precondition of the law of identity itself. To quote Fichte, X at least is in the self and posited by the self, for it is the self which asserts the above proposition, and so asserts it by virtue of X as a law, which X or law must, therefore, be given to the self. And since it is asserted absolutely and without further ground, must be given to the self by itself alone. Unquote. We've now arrived at the self-positing I, which is the absolute foundation of Fichte's entire system. And unlike the proposition A is A, which possesses no content, I is I possesses content precisely because the I posits itself as its own content. In its act of self-positing, the absolute I posits itself as existing, and this very act constitutes its existence. To quote Fichte, but the proposition I am I has quite another significance than A is A, for the latter proposition had content only on a certain condition, namely, if A is posited. But the proposition I am I is unconditionally and absolutely valid, since it is the same as X. It is valid not only in form, but also in content. In it the self is posited, not on condition, but absolutely, with the predicate of self-equality. Hence, it is posited, and the proposition may also be expressed, I am. Unquote. And this is the self-positing absolute I, in whom all reality exists. Now, before concluding, I'd like to compare Fichte's absolute I to Zizek's absolute I, since we've spoken about the latter quite a bit in other videos. For Žižek, while the I is self-relating and nothing more than its act, he emphasizes the empty nature of the subject. That's to say, rather than the subject containing all of reality within itself, it's a purely negative entity, a void deprived of all substantial content. Thus, far from containing all of reality within itself, the subject is a whole in reality. Quote, "What Fichte failed to see was that, in the subject-object relationship, the subject is a negative entity, a pure self-relating negativity, which is why, in order not to implode into itself, it needs a minimum of objectal support. That is to say, although Fichte repeatedly emphasizes how the subject is not a thing, but a self-relating process, he conceives of the subject in an all too positive way when he claims that the absolute I is all reality. The subject is, on the contrary, a whole in reality."